He didn't raise his voice when the crown hit the floor, he simply chose not to pick it up. The docking bay stretched for nearly half a mile, a cathedral of steel and humming light, where every surface gleamed under rows of violet luminescent strips and the air carried the faint tang of ionized fuel and overheated circuits, and when the royal vessel descended through the open hangar ceiling, its engines whispering instead of roaring, the entire station seemed to hold its breath as personnel lined the perimeter in perfect formation, boots aligned, heads bowed, every eye lowered in silent obedience to a presence they had never seen but had been trained their entire lives to fear. And in the middle of that orchestrated stillness stood Ethan Cole, sleeves rolled to his elbows, fingers stained with dark grease, a calibration tool still hanging loosely from his hand as if he had simply paused mid-task rather than stepped into a moment that demanded reverence, because to him, it was just another ship docking, another system that might fail, another problem waiting to be fixed. And nothing about polished metal or royal insignia changed the way gravity pulled or circuits burned out. And when the landing struts touched down with a soft, controlled hiss, a small object slipped from the edge of the descending ramp and struck the metal floor with a sharp, ringing note that echoed farther than it should have, a delicate chain of silver alloy, holding a crest that pulsed faintly with embedded light, unmistakably royal, unmistakably valuable, and yet no one moved, not the officers, not the guards, not even the station commander who stood closest, because protocol was clear and fear was clearer. And so the object lay there between them like a test no one dared to take, until Ethan stepped forward, not toward it but past it, his boots making a quiet, steady rhythm against the floor as he crossed the invisible line that separated obedience from indifference, and for a fraction of a second, every head tilted just enough to notice, just enough to wonder if he would stop, if he would bend, if he would acknowledge what everyone else treated as sacred, but he didn't, he walked right by it as if it were a loose bolt or a discarded tool, something without meaning, something not worth the interruption, and behind him, the ramp fully extended and she appeared, Princess Lixra Vane, 19 years old, heir to a system-spanning empire, her blue-toned skin catching the artificial light in shifting gradients like deep water, her posture straight, her gaze sharp, trained from birth to expect submission before she ever spoke, and when her eyes followed the silent ripple of attention through the crowd, they landed on the one figure who had not bowed, not hesitated, not even glanced back, and in that moment, something unfamiliar flickered behind her composed expression, not anger, not yet, but a precise, cutting curiosity, because every world she had visited had followed the same rules, power was recognized, authority was visible, respect was automatic, and yet here, in a place that smelled like oil and effort and ordinary human work, a man had just walked past her symbol of rule as if it meant nothing at all, and he didn't look back, not once, as if whatever she represented simply didn't reach him. The sound of boots shifting echoed a second too late, like the station itself was correcting a mistake no one wanted to admit, and one by one the crew lowered themselves further, heads dipping, shoulders tightening, as if they could erase the moment that had already happened, but Ethan did not turn back and did not slow down, his figure disappearing between columns of cargo crates stacked nearly 10 feet high, their surfaces flickering with worn identification codes and maintenance tags, while behind him the princess stepped fully onto the hangar floor and the temperature seemed to change without actually dropping, a subtle pressure settling into the air as her presence filled the space, and her gaze remained fixed on the path he had taken, not on the kneeling crowd, not on the officers waiting for instruction, but on the empty space where a human had chosen not to acknowledge her, and when her voice finally came it was calm, controlled, but edged with something sharper than command. As she spoke in perfect translated English, asking a single question that did not need to be loud to carry across the bay, "Who is that man?" and no one answered immediately because no one had expected the question to matter, and when the station commander finally rose just enough to speak, his voice careful and precise, he identified Ethan Cole as a maintenance engineer assigned to external systems, a civilian contractor with no diplomatic clearance and no formal standing. And for a moment there was silence again, not empty this time but heavy, because the explanation did not match what she had just witnessed, and Lixra's eyes shifted briefly to the small silver crest still resting on the floor between them, its faint glow pulsing like a quiet reminder of everything it represented, and without bending or breaking posture she extended one slender hand and one of her attendants stepped forward instantly to retrieve it, presenting it back to her with both hands as protocol demanded, but she did not immediately take it, her gaze still distant, still calculating, as if the object had lost some of its meaning in the span of a few seconds, and when she finally accepted it she did so without looking, her attention already moving elsewhere, already following the absence rather than the presence, and far across the bay Ethan reached a maintenance console bolted to a support pillar, its screen flickering with a diagnostic loop that had been running long before any royal ship arrived, and he tapped the surface with 2 fingers, bringing up a set of system errors that scrolled in dull amber text, his focus narrowing instantly, completely, as if nothing outside that panel existed, and the faint hum of the station returned to something normal around him, mechanical and predictable, and a younger technician standing nearby hesitated before speaking, glancing back toward the landing zone with visible tension before lowering his voice and asking if Ethan understood who had just arrived, and Ethan did not look up, did not pause, simply adjusted a calibration value by a fraction and replied in an even tone that the docking clamps were misaligned by less than half an inch and if they did not correct it the next departure would trigger a system warning. And the technician blinked, caught between disbelief and confusion, pressing again, saying that it was not just any visitor, that it was royalty, that people got reassigned for less than what had just happened, and Ethan finally leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose as he wiped a streak of grease across the back of his hand, his eyes scanning the numbers one more time before he answered, then they should fix the clamps. And there was no defiance in his voice, no challenge, just a simple prioritization of what mattered, and somewhere behind him, far enough that he could not hear but close enough that it would reach him eventually, a 19-year-old princess stood holding a symbol of power that suddenly felt lighter than it should have, trying to understand why the only man who had seen it fall had treated it like it weighed nothing at all. The corridor outside the maintenance sector stretched nearly 200 yards in a straight line, lit by a sequence of overhead panels that flickered just slightly out of sync, creating a rhythm that most people ignored but Ethan had learned to read like a pulse, each irregularity telling him where the station was aging, where it was being pushed too hard. And as he moved deeper into the quieter part of the deck the distant hum of the docking bay faded into something softer, more mechanical, more honest, and he preferred it that way because machines did not expect anything from you except precision, and precision was something he could give without negotiation, and when he reached the access hatch leading to the external clamp controls he paused just long enough to pull a small diagnostic module from his belt, its casing scratched from years of use, its screen lighting up with a muted blue glow that reflected faintly across his face, and he was already halfway through running a manual override sequence when the sound of footsteps interrupted the steady rhythm of the corridor, not hurried, not hesitant, but deliberate, measured in a way that did not belong to this part of the station, and he did not turn immediately because interruptions were common and rarely important, but the footsteps did not pass, they stopped a few feet behind him, and the air shifted again, not colder this time but sharper, as if the space itself had become aware of being observed, and when Ethan finally glanced over his shoulder his eyes met a presence that did not fit the worn metal walls and exposed wiring of the maintenance deck. Princess Lixra stood there without her full procession, only a single attendant at a respectful distance, her posture unchanged, her expression composed but no longer distant, and for a moment neither of them spoke, because this was not a place built for ceremony or command, it was a place built for function, and her presence here felt almost out of place, like a symbol carried into a room that did not recognize symbols, and when she did speak her voice was quieter than before, not because it needed to be but because the space demanded it. You saw it fall, she said, not as an accusation but as a statement, and Ethan turned back to the console, his fingers resuming their work with steady movements as if the conversation were simply another variable to account for, and after a second he answered without looking at her, yes, and the simplicity of the response seemed to hang there longer than expected, and she took a step closer, her gaze shifting briefly to the diagnostic panel, the scrolling lines of data reflecting in her eyes, unfamiliar but not incomprehensible, and there was a pause before she asked the question that had followed her from the docking bay to this corridor, why did you ignore it, and Ethan adjusted a setting, watching the numbers stabilize before he replied, because it was not mine, and he said it the same way he might explain why he did not adjust a system he had not been assigned to, not dismissive, not defensive, just factual, and Lixra studied him, her expression tightening almost imperceptibly as she processed the answer. Because in every world she had known ownership was defined by power, by claim, by status, and yet here was A man defining it by something else entirely, something that did not include her authority, and she lifted the small silver crest slightly, letting the faint light pulse between them as if presenting evidence. It belongs to me, she said, and Ethan finally turned fully to face her, not stepping closer, not stepping back, simply meeting her gaze with the same steady focus he had given the console, and he nodded once, acknowledging the statement without reacting to it. Then it was not lost, he said, and for the first time since she had stepped onto the station, Lixra did not have an immediate response. Because there was no challenge in his tone, no resistance, no attempt to diminish what she held, only a quiet certainty that did not bend around her title, and the corridor fell silent again, filled only by the low hum of systems returning to alignment, and somewhere in that silence, something shifted, not in the station, not in the machinery, but in the space between them, where expectation met something it had never been designed to measure. The diagnostic panel emitted a soft confirmation tone as the alignment values locked into place within acceptable margins, a quiet success that barely registered beyond the small screen, yet Ethan watched it for another second as if confirming something deeper than numbers before he powered the module down and secured it back onto his belt. And the motion carried a finality that suggested he had already decided what mattered and what did not, and when he stepped away from the console the corridor seemed to widen slightly, as if making space for a conversation neither of them had planned to have, and Lixra remained where she was, the faint glow of the crest dimming in her hand as if responding to her stillness, and for the first time since she had approached him there was a hesitation in her posture, subtle but real, a shift in weight that would have gone unnoticed by anyone who had not spent years reading mechanical tolerances and human behavior with the same careful attention. And Ethan noticed it the same way he noticed everything else, without staring, without reacting, simply registering it as part of the environment, and when he moved to pass her he did not wait for permission and did not change his pace, but he did not ignore her either, he acknowledged her presence with the smallest adjustment of his path, a fraction of an inch that avoided contact without signaling deference, and it was that precise balance that made her speak again, not louder, not sharper, but more directly. On my world, no one would walk away from me, and the statement carried neither pride nor threat, only a fact that had never been questioned until now, and Ethan slowed just enough to respond, turning his head slightly but not fully stopping, his voice even and unforced. Then your world has not met many people who fix things, and the words were not dismissive, not arrogant, but grounded in a reality that did not intersect with hierarchy, and Lixra studied him again, this time not as an anomaly to correct but as a pattern she could not yet solve, and her gaze dropped briefly to his hands, the faint traces of grease, the small cuts and worn lines that spoke of work repeated thousands of times, and something about that detail held her attention longer than it should have, because it represented a kind of value that could not be granted or revoked, only earned and maintained, and she lifted her eyes back to his, a new question forming, one that did not fit within the protocols she had been taught. You were not afraid, she said, and it was not a question, not entirely, but there was uncertainty beneath it, a need for confirmation that contradicted everything she understood about power, and Ethan finally stopped. Not because of her title, not because of the crest in her hand, but because the question itself deserved a complete answer, and he turned to face her fully again, the corridor lights reflecting softly off the metal walls behind him, and he considered his words for a brief moment before speaking. Of what? And the simplicity of the reply forced her to define something she had never needed to define before, and she hesitated, the silence stretching just long enough to make the answer feel less certain than it should have been, and when she spoke again her voice was quieter, almost thoughtful, of offending me, and Ethan held her gaze, steady and unflinching, and there was no challenge in his expression, no intention to provoke, only clarity, and he shook his head once, a small, almost imperceptible motion. I did not offend you, he said, and the words landed differently than anything she had heard that day, not because of what they said but because of what they did not include. There was no apology, no justification, no attempt to reshape the moment, only a quiet refusal to accept the premise itself, and for a second the corridor felt completely still, the hum of the station fading into the background as if even the systems were waiting, and Lixra looked down at the crest again, its surface reflecting the corridor lights in muted patterns, and when she spoke her voice carried a trace of something new, something that did not belong to command or expectation. Then what did you do? And Ethan glanced once more toward the console behind him, now stable and silent. Before answering, I kept working, and he turned again, continuing down the corridor without waiting for a response, leaving behind not defiance, not disrespect, but something far more unsettling. To someone raised in absolute authority, a man who simply chose what mattered and acted accordingly, and as Lixra stood there, the crest resting lightly in her hand, she realized that for the first time in her life, she had not been ignored out of fear or rebellion, but out of something she did not yet understand, and that made it harder to dismiss than any insult ever could. The corridor felt different after he left, not quieter in sound but quieter in expectation, as if something unspoken had shifted the balance of the space itself, and Lixra remained standing where he had passed her, the faint glow of the crest dimming further in her hand as the station lights reclaimed dominance, and for several seconds she did not move, not because she lacked direction but because direction had never before required reconsideration, and her attendant shifted slightly at a respectful distance, waiting for a command that did not come, because none of the protocols she had been trained to follow accounted for what had just occurred, and when she finally turned it was not back toward the docking bay or toward the prepared escort routes, but in the direction Ethan had gone, her steps measured. Deliberate, not hurried but purposeful in a way that felt unfamiliar even to herself, and as she moved deeper into the maintenance sector the environment changed gradually, the polished surfaces giving way to exposed conduits and worn flooring marked by years of use, the air carrying a stronger scent of heated metal and circulating coolant, and she noticed details she would have ignored before. The way lights flickered just slightly before stabilizing, the faint vibration underfoot from systems operating beyond visible walls, and she realized with a quiet clarity that this part of the station did not care who she was, it functioned regardless of titles, regardless of presence, and that realization stayed with her as she approached another open work area where Ethan stood beside a panel half removed from the wall, its internal components exposed in neat layers of circuitry and fiber lines. And he was already working again, hands steady, attention fixed, as if the conversation in the corridor had been nothing more than a brief interruption in a much longer process, and she stopped a few feet away, observing without announcing herself, watching the way he adjusted a connection by less than an inch, the way he paused to listen rather than look, as if sound itself carried information, and for the first time she understood that his silence was not emptiness but focus, not absence but intention directed somewhere specific, and when he finally spoke without turning his voice was calm, almost conversational. If you are waiting for something to change, it already did, and the statement caught her slightly off guard because she had not made a sound, had not signaled her presence in any formal way, and yet he had noticed, not through status or attention, but through awareness, and she stepped closer then, her gaze moving from the panel to him. What changed? She asked, and Ethan tightened a connection point before answering. You came here instead of calling someone. And he said it without judgment, without implication, just an observation placed between them like any other measured value, and Lixra considered that, her eyes shifting briefly to the surrounding equipment, the worn tools, the quiet efficiency of the space, and she realized he was right. She had chosen to come here, to step outside the structure that defined her world, and that choice had not been commanded, not expected, and certainly not necessary, and yet she had made it, and when she looked back at him there was something different in her expression, not uncertainty exactly, but a question that was no longer about him alone. On my world, she began, her voice softer than before. People approach me because they must, and Ethan finished securing the panel before finally turning to face her, wiping his hands slowly with a cloth that had seen years of use, his movements unhurried, grounded. Here, he replied, people approach when they have a reason, and the distinction settled between them, simple in words but heavy in meaning, and Lixra lowered her gaze briefly, the crest still in her hand catching a reflection of the dim overhead lights, and for the first time she did not lift it as a symbol, did not reference it as authority, she simply held it, as if it were an object separate from herself, and when she spoke again her voice carried something quieter, more personal. And what reason would someone need? And Ethan looked at her, not past her, not through her title, but at her, and there was no hesitation in his answer, a real one, and the words were not dismissive, not challenging. But they removed every layer that did not matter, leaving only something she had never needed to consider before, and as the station hummed steadily around them, Lixra felt that same subtle shift again, not in the machinery, not in the lights, but in the space where certainty used to be, replaced now by something far more difficult to ignore, the quiet realization that respect here was not given because of who she was, but because of what she chose to do. And for the first time since she had stepped onto the station, she did not reach for authority to answer that realization. She simply stood there, holding it, the same way she held the crest, unsure of its weight in a place that measured value differently. The panel clicked into place with a soft magnetic seal. The kind of sound that did not draw attention but confirmed something had been set right, and Ethan ran his hand along the edge once, more out of habit than necessity, before stepping back to observe the system status on a nearby display, the numbers stabilizing into clean, predictable lines that required no further adjustment, and for a moment he simply watched, not because he expected failure but because he respected the process of things settling into balance, and behind him Lixra remained. Still, her presence no longer disruptive but not yet integrated into the rhythm of the space, like a note held just slightly outside the melody, and the crest in her hand had dimmed almost completely now, its glow faint enough to be mistaken for reflection rather than emission, and she found herself looking at it less and less, her attention drawn instead to the way Ethan interacted with his environment, the quiet certainty of someone who did not need acknowledgement to validate his actions, and that absence of need unsettled her more than any defiance could have, because it removed the foundation on which her authority had always stood, and she took a slow breath, the recycled air carrying a metallic edge that felt sharper now that she noticed it, and she asked, not as a command but as something closer to a request, if I had called you instead of coming here, would you have come? And Ethan did not answer immediately, not because he was avoiding the question but because he was finishing one last check, his eyes moving across the display, confirming that the system would hold under load, and only then did he respond, his voice even, grounded in the same quiet logic that had guided everything he had done so far. If it was about the system, yes, and Lixra's gaze narrowed slightly, not in irritation but in focus, and if it was about me, she pressed, and this time he turned to face her fully, not out of obligation but because the question had shifted from function to meaning, and he considered her for a brief second before answering, that depends on why you needed me, and the words landed with a weight that was not imposed but inherent, and she felt it, the distinction between being required and being chosen, between authority and reason, and for a moment she said nothing, because the answer did not give her control, it gave her responsibility, and that was something she had not been prepared to carry in this context, and the attendant behind her shifted again, a subtle reminder of the structure she represented, but she did not turn, did not acknowledge it, her attention fixed on the man who had quietly redefined the rules of their interaction without ever stating them, and she looked down at the crest once more, turning it slightly between her fingers, watching the way the light caught along its edges, and she realized that for the first time it felt like an object she held rather than an extension of herself, and that realization was both unsettling and clarifying, and when she spoke again her voice carried a different tone, less certain, more deliberate. On my world, people are taught their place from the moment they understand language, and Ethan leaned lightly against the console, arms relaxed at his sides, listening without interruption, and she continued, her gaze lifting to meet his, they know who they are in relation to others before they know who they are alone, and there was a pause then, not because she had finished but because she was considering something as she said it, something that had never needed to be examined before, and Ethan nodded once, not in agreement or disagreement but in acknowledgement of the statement. And he replied in the same measured tone, here, people figure that out by what they do, and the simplicity of the response stripped away everything that did not apply, leaving only action as the defining factor, and Lixra absorbed that, the idea settling into place slowly, not as a contradiction but as an alternative, and for the first time she felt the absence of expectation not as a loss of control but as an open space, something unstructured, undefined, and potentially meaningful, and the station hummed steadily around them, systems aligned, processes continuing without pause, and in that steady rhythm she found herself standing not as a ruler being observed, but as a person being understood, and the difference was quiet, almost imperceptible, but it changed the weight of everything she carried. The station lights dimmed for less than a second before stabilizing again, a subtle fluctuation that most would ignore but one that Ethan noticed immediately, his eyes shifting to the overhead panel as if listening to something beneath the surface, and without a word he pushed himself off the console and stepped toward a secondary interface mounted along the wall, his movements precise, efficient, already anticipating what the system was about to confirm, and Lixra watched him, not with curiosity now but with a growing awareness that his attention moved ahead of events rather than reacting to them, and when the alert finally appeared it was quiet, a narrow band of amber text scrolling across the display indicating a cascade delay in the primary power routing grid connected to the docking sector, not a failure yet but a misalignment that would become one if left unresolved. And Ethan's hand moved across the interface, pulling up a layered schematic of the station's internal systems, lines of light tracing pathways through the structure like veins carrying energy instead of blood, and he leaned closer, studying the pattern, adjusting variables in real time as if he were correcting something alive rather than mechanical, and Lixra stepped forward without realizing it, drawn by the shift in the atmosphere, the way the room itself seemed to tighten around a problem that had not yet fully formed, and she spoke. "Quieter now, what is happening?" And Ethan did not look at her as he answered, his focus locked on the display. "A delay in the load distribution from the docking clamps we just aligned, the system is compensating, but it is not doing it well," and his fingers moved again, rerouting a sequence, isolating a segment before it could ripple outward, and the faint hum of the station changed pitch slightly, not louder but sharper, as if the structure itself was adjusting under pressure. And Lixra felt it this time, not through knowledge but through sensation, a subtle vibration under her feet that carried a question she did not know how to answer. And she glanced back toward her attendant, who remained still, waiting, because this was not a situation covered by command, and when she looked forward again Ethan had already opened a secondary panel, its interior glowing with a soft blue light, components arranged in layered precision that spoke of design far beyond simple function, and he reached inside carefully, adjusting a connection by fractions of an inch. His movement steady despite the increasing complexity of the problem, and Lixra watched him, the crest still in her hand, forgotten now as something more immediate took its place, and for the first time she understood that this was not about authority or protocol, this was about consequence, about what happened when systems failed and people depended on them without ever seeing the work that kept them stable, and she stepped closer again, her voice carrying something new, not command, not expectation, but something closer to urgency. "Do you need assistance?" And Ethan paused for a fraction of a second, not because he was surprised by the offer but because he was measuring it, fitting it into the reality of what he was doing, and when he spoke his voice remained calm, but there was a slight shift in tone, an acknowledgement of the moment. "Can you hold this steady?" And he handed her a small stabilizing tool, its surface cool against her fingers, its function simple but precise. And she hesitated only briefly before taking it, positioning herself where he indicated, her movements careful, deliberate, as she held the component in place while he worked, and in that moment the distance between them changed again, not through words but through action, and the station's hum began to settle, the sharp edge smoothing back into something consistent, something reliable, and Ethan secured the final connection before withdrawing his hand, closing the panel with a soft click that echoed slightly in the quiet space, and for a second neither of them moved. The tool still in her hand, the system stabilizing around them, and then he nodded once, not formal, not ceremonial, just acknowledgement, that helped, and the words were simple, but they carried a weight she had never received before, because they were not given for who she was, but for what she had done, and as she looked at the tool in her hand, then back at him, she realized that for the first time since she had stepped onto the station, she had not been observed, or obeyed, or deferred to, she had been included, and the difference settled quietly into place, reshaping something deeper than expectation. The stabilizing tool felt lighter once the system returned to balance, its faint vibration fading into stillness as Lixra held it a moment longer than necessary, as if confirming that what had just happened was real and not simply another controlled outcome dictated by rank or expectation, and Ethan had already turned back to the console, his attention shifting forward without pause, checking residual readings, ensuring that the correction would hold under continuous load, and the station responded accordingly, its hum settling into a deeper, steadier tone that filled the space with quiet reliability, and for a few seconds neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left to command and nothing left to fix, only the aftermath of something shared, something unspoken that had changed the distance between them in a way that could not be reversed, and Lixra slowly lowered the tool, placing it carefully on the edge of the panel instead of handing it back immediately, her movements deliberate, almost thoughtful, and when she finally spoke her voice carried none of the authority it had when she first stepped onto the station, only clarity. On my world, assistance is given because it is ordered, and Ethan glanced at her briefly before returning his focus to the display, acknowledging the statement without interrupting its meaning, and she continued, her gaze shifting from the quiet machinery to him. Here, you asked, and there was something in the way she said it that revealed she was still processing the difference, still measuring it against everything she had known, and Ethan finished his final check before powering down the interface, the screen dimming to a soft idle glow, and he turned to face her fully again, his posture relaxed, grounded. I asked because it mattered, he said, and the words were simple, but they carried a precision that left no space for interpretation, and Lixra absorbed that, her eyes lowering briefly to the crest still in her other hand, its surface now dull, its significance quieter, and she realized that for the first time it had not been the most important thing in the room, not even close, and she turned it slightly, then without ceremony placed it beside the tool on the panel, not discarded, not rejected, but set aside. And the action was small, almost insignificant to anyone else, but in that space it shifted something fundamental, because she had chosen to separate herself from it, even if only for a moment, and Ethan noticed, not with surprise but with the same quiet awareness he had shown from the beginning, and he did not comment on it, did not acknowledge it directly, because he did not need to, the action spoke clearly enough. And the silence that followed was not empty, it was full, carrying the weight of everything that had changed without requiring explanation, and Lixra looked at the tool, then at the crest, then back at him, and there was no command left in her posture, only a question that had already begun to answer itself, and when she spoke again her voice was steady, softer but not uncertain. If I had not come here, if I had remained where I was expected to be, this would still have happened, and she gestured slightly toward the panel, toward the system that had almost misaligned. Again, and Ethan nodded once, his gaze steady. Yes, he said, and there was no judgment in the answer, no implication that she had been required or unnecessary, only truth, and she held that for a moment, letting it settle, and then she asked the question that mattered more than the first, then why does it feel different? And Ethan looked at her, not as a subject, not as a ruler, but as someone standing in the same space, asking something real, and he answered without hesitation, because you were part of it, and the words landed quietly, but they carried more weight than anything that had been said before, because they did not elevate her, did not diminish her, they simply included her. And Lixra exhaled slowly, something inside her shifting into place, something that did not rely on expectation or control, and for the first time since she had stepped onto the station, she understood that respect here was not something she brought with her, it was something that existed only when it was shared, and the realization did not overwhelm her, it settled, steady and clear, like the hum of the station returning to balance, and she stood there, no longer apart from the space, no longer defined by distance, but present within it, in a way that required nothing more than the choice to remain. The station returned to its steady rhythm as if nothing remarkable had happened, the hum of balanced systems filling the air with a quiet certainty that most would never notice, and Ethan moved past the panel without ceremony, collecting his tools one by one and securing them to his belt with practiced efficiency, his attention already shifting to the next task waiting somewhere else in the structure. Because there was always something else, always another system that needed attention, and for a moment it seemed as though he would simply leave again, the same way he had before, without hesitation, without acknowledgement beyond what was necessary, but this time the space behind him was not empty, and Lixra did not remain still, she stepped forward, not quickly, not urgently, but with intention, closing the small distance between them that had once felt impossible, and when she reached the panel she did not pick up the crest immediately, instead her fingers hovered above it, then shifted, lifting the stabilizing tool first, turning it slightly as if committing its weight and shape to memory before placing it carefully back where it belonged, and only then did she take the crest again, holding it differently now, not as something to be presented, but as something she understood she could set down again if she chose to, and when she looked up Ethan had paused, not fully turned toward her, but not fully walking away either, as if waiting for something he would not ask for. And she met his gaze, steady, composed, but changed in a way that did not need explanation, and for a second there was silence again, but it was not the same silence as before, it was lighter, carrying something almost unfamiliar, something that did not belong to protocol or expectation, and she spoke, her voice calm, but with a trace of something new beneath it, something closer to curiosity than command. On your world, do people always walk away like that? And Ethan tilted his head slightly, considering the question. A faint hint of something softer passing through his expression, not quite amusement, not quite surprise, but close to both. Only when staying would not change anything, he replied, and the answer settled between them, simple and complete. And Lixra allowed herself a small pause before responding, her gaze steady. Then perhaps you should not walk away yet. And the words were not an order, not even a request in the way she would have once understood it. They were an invitation, quiet, uncertain in its own way, but genuine. And Ethan studied her for a brief moment, not searching for hidden meaning, but measuring the intent behind the words. And something in her posture, in the absence of expectation, made the answer easier than it should have been. And he nodded once, a small, deliberate motion that carried more agreement than any formal acceptance. And he shifted his weight slightly, not preparing to leave, but settling where he stood. And the change was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it altered the space between them again, not closing it, but making it shared. And Lixra glanced briefly down the corridor, where her attendants still waited, silent, observing, a reminder of everything she represented beyond this moment. And then she looked back at Ethan, the faintest curve touching her expression, not quite a smile, but something close enough to matter. There is a reception prepared, she said, her tone lighter than before. It involves a great deal of standing still and listening to people say things they have practiced for hours. And Ethan exhaled quietly through his nose, the hint of that same almost smile returning. Sounds inefficient, he said, and she inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the observation. It often is, she replied, and for the first time there was something unmistakably shared in the exchange, something that did not depend on who they were supposed to be. And she continued, her voice steady, but carrying that same subtle shift. You could come and see it for yourself. And there was no weight behind the offer, no expectation of acceptance, only the possibility placed gently between them. And Ethan looked at her, then briefly at the corridor beyond, as if measuring the distance between responsibility and choice. And when he answered, his voice remained even, but there was something lighter in it now, something that had not been there before. If the systems hold, he said. And Lixra glanced at the panel, at the quiet confirmation lights now glowing steady and green, and then back at him. Then I suppose they will, she replied, and for a moment neither of them moved, the station humming steadily around them. The weight of titles and expectations held at a distance neither of them needed to acknowledge. And somewhere in that quiet, something new had begun, not declared.